The lake's surface held the reflection of the dying sun, a sheet of hammered copper that barely rippled. Elias stood at the edge of the tall grass, his weight shifted onto his heels as he watched the scene unfold. A few yards away, the fireflies had begun their nightly pulse, glowing in rhythmic bursts against the darkening tree line. His grandchildren darted between the pines, their voices thin and bright in the cooling air. One of them let out a sudden, sharp laugh, tripping over a protruding root and tumbling into the soft moss. Elias took a slow step forward, checking the perimeter out of habit rather than necessity. The air smelled of damp earth and coming night. He traced the movement of a single spark of light as it drifted toward the water, lost in the simple, steady rhythm of the evening. There was no wind. The world felt contained within the boundaries of the park, a small pocket of stillness where the only movement was the play of children and the slow, inevitable fading of the light. He leaned against a thick oak, listening to the quiet rustle of leaves, content to let the minutes stretch out into the dusk. The sun dipped lower, painting the water in long, liquid strokes of gold. Elias shifted his weight, his fingers brushing the brim of his cap as he adjusted it against the fading glare. The light caught the stray particles of dust hanging in the air, turning them into suspended embers. He watched his grandchildren, their small figures silhouetted against the bright reflection on the lake. They were chasing a cluster of fireflies that danced just out of reach, their laughter bubbling up and echoing off the nearby pines. It was a sound that seemed to pull the tension from his shoulders. He remained still, letting the warmth of the day linger on his skin even as the temperature began to drop. Every detail felt deliberate. The rhythmic slapping of water against the dock, the distant call of a nightbird, the way the shadows stretched across the path like long, dark fingers. He felt the heavy, comfortable weight of the moment. He smiled, watching them run, enjoying the simple, unhurried pace of the evening. For now, the world was small, safe, and perfectly contained within this golden light. The light shifted from gold to a bruised, deepening purple. Elias tilted his head, his focus snagging on a sudden change in the forest. The rhythmic chirping of insects, a constant background hum for the last hour, cut out completely. It was not a gradual fade, but a hard, unnatural silence that seemed to press against his eardrums. He stood upright, his spine stiffening as he scanned the tree line. His grandchildren stopped their game, sensing the shift in the air, and stood frozen in the tall grass. A faint vibration traveled through the soles of his boots, rhythmic and heavy. It came from the direction of the park entrance, a low-frequency growl that did not belong to the wind or the water. Elias squinted into the gloom, watching the path where the shadows were thickest. The rumble grew, a persistent, throbbing pulse that rattled the loose gravel on the trail. He reached out, resting a steadying hand on his grandson's shoulder, and pulled the boy closer. The forest held its breath, waiting. The rumble sharpened into the distinct, grinding sound of heavy tires fighting for traction on dirt. The peace had reached its end. The trees shuddered as the first black shape tore through the foliage. It was a massive vehicle, heavy and fast, its headlights cutting through the twilight like twin blades. Behind it, two more followed, their engines roaring in a chaotic, overlapping symphony that drowned out the night. Gravel sprayed in a violent arc as they accelerated, tires digging deep into the soft earth of the path. Elias pulled the children behind him, his boots digging into the dirt as he braced for impact. The lead vehicle drifted, its back end swinging wide to block the narrow trail. The second SUV pulled alongside it, and the third slammed into the rear, effectively creating a wall of steel that sealed the exit. The air filled with the smell of burning rubber and kicked-up dust that tasted like grit and exhaust. The engines cut out simultaneously, leaving a ringing, pressurized silence in their wake. Dust swirled around the vehicles, obscuring the doors. The SUVs were positioned at sharp angles, their frames vibrating from the sudden, jarring stop. There was no way out. The path was gone. Elias stood motionless, his lungs tight, staring at the dark, metallic barricade that now defined their world. The heavy doors swung open with a rhythmic, mechanical clatter. 6 men stepped out in perfect unison, their movements fluid and practiced. They did not shout, They did not hesitate. Each man moved to a pre-assigned position, creating a wide semicircle that pinned Elias and the children against the lake bank. Their weapons were already raised, stocks pressed firmly against their shoulders, barrels tracking every shift in the air. The harsh, artificial light from the SUV interior illuminated the aggressive posture of the group. These were not random interlopers. They moved with the calculated efficiency of soldiers who had performed this maneuver dozens of times before. Elias watched the way their fingers rested near the triggers, the way their eyes scanned the perimeter with cold, detached precision. The threat was not just the steel in their hands, but the absolute control they exerted over the space. He felt the weight of the situation settle into his chest. There was no room for error, no gap in their formation to exploit. The men closed the distance, their boots crunching on the gravel in a synchronized beat. The last man signaled with a sharp, downward hand gesture, and the perimeter tightened. They had arrived with a singular, lethal intent. A heavy hand landed on the shoulder of the youngest child. She shrieked, the sound piercing the quiet of the woods. Elias lunged forward, but a rifle butt slammed into his midsection, knocking the air from his lungs and dropping him to his knees. He gasped, his vision blurring as he fought for breath. Two men grabbed the children by their arms, hoisting them off the ground despite their frantic kicking and desperate cries. Elias reached out, fingers clawing at the air, but another strike to his head sent him sprawling into the dirt. He tasted copper. He tried to scramble upright, but iron-like grips clamped onto his biceps, hauling him toward the rear of the center vehicle. The children were shoved into the hold first. Their sobbing intensified, echoing off the cold metal walls of the van. Elias was thrown in behind them, the force of the impact rattling his teeth. He hit the floor hard, his hands scraping against the steel surface. The captors stood in the threshold for a second, staring down with cold, unblinking eyes, before turning away to prepare the final restraint. The children clung to him, shivering, their small frames shaking with every breath. The forest view vanished as the heavy doors swung inward, cutting off the last of the fading light. The slam of the doors sounded like a gavel, sealing them into a tomb of vibrating steel. Darkness rushed in, absolute and suffocating, broken only by thin slivers of light at the door seams. The engine roared to life, a deep, resonant rumble that shook the floorboards beneath Elias. He didn't wait for the vehicle to settle. He reached out in the pitch black, his hands finding the small, shivering frames of the children. He pulled them close, pressing their heads against his chest to muffle their terrified gasps. The van lurched forward, tires spinning on loose gravel before catching traction. The sudden acceleration threw them sideways, bodies sliding across the slick, metallic floor until they hit the sidewall with a dull thud. Elias braced his feet against the wheel well, locking his muscles to absorb the impact of the uneven road. He kept his breathing steady, rhythmic and slow, forcing the panic out of his own system to keep the children calm. As the vehicle gathered speed, he began to map the interior with his fingertips. Cold rivets, sharp corners, a loose floor panel. He scanned the dark, looking for anything that could serve as a tool. Every bump in the road was a physical trial, but his hands remained focused, searching the shadows for an opening. The van swerved, and the partition door rattled. Elias pressed his ear to the cold steel, listening to the rhythmic thrum of the engine and the voices beyond. He shifted his weight, carefully creating a narrow sight line through a gap in the metal frame. He peered into the front cabin. 6 men. He counted them twice to be certain. 2 sat in the front, their posture rigid, while 4 others occupied the middle bench. Elias scanned their hands. 2 assault rifles rested against their knees, barrels pointed toward the floor, while the others kept their sidearms holstered. He took a slow breath, his pulse leveling out as the adrenaline receded, replaced by a singular, icy clarity. He cataloged every detail, the weight of their movements, the reach of their arms, and the lack of awareness in their posture. They were arrogant, assuming their prisoners were already broken. Elias withdrew his gaze, his mind shifting gears. He stopped feeling the fear and started measuring the distance to the door. The timing of the engine's vibrations and the exact placement of the guards. Every muscle in his body went still. He was no longer a captive. He was a hunter waiting for the smallest lapse in their rhythm. The road worsened. The van hit a massive pothole, tossing the occupants into the air before slamming them back onto the steel floor. Elias used the violent jostling to mask his movement. He slid his hand down toward his ankle, his fingers tracing the contour of his lower leg. He felt the rigid edge of the blade, tucked securely against his skin. His heart rate remained steady, a low, rhythmic pulse that ignored the chaotic swaying of the vehicle. He worked the fastenings with practiced precision, his thumbs moving with surgical speed. The metal of the knife was cold, biting into his palm as he finally pried it loose. He did not pull it out yet. He kept his hand tucked close to his body, concealing the steel beneath his own forearm while he adjusted his position. The weight of the blade felt solid, grounding him. A grim resolve settled over his features. He felt the vibration of the road through his boots, mapping the terrain by the frequency of the bumps. He was ready. He tested the grip, feeling the balance of the weapon, and tucked it back into a position where it could be drawn in a fraction of a second. The van continued its relentless pace, unaware that the dynamic had shifted. The van changed its rhythm. The steady drone of the engine deepened, then fluctuated as the driver downshifted. Elias felt the vehicle drag as it slowed, the tires gripping the loose gravel of the forest road with a rhythmic crunching sound. He knew the layout of this sector. The road narrowed significantly near the old bridge, forcing a sharp, 90-degree turn to bypass the ravine. He pressed his feet firmly against the floor, anchoring his weight to compensate for the coming lateral force. He felt his muscles coil, tension radiating from his core to his limbs. He monitored the cabin's atmosphere through the thin metal partition. The guards began to shift in their seats, their weight leaning in anticipation of the turn. The van began its arc, tilting slightly as it fought against the momentum. This was the moment. Elias ignored the pull of gravity and focused entirely on the guard closest to him. He braced his shoulder against the side panel, finding the perfect angle to maximize his explosive movement. He waited, his breath held, tracking the exact point where the vehicle would reach its maximum instability. His hand hovered inches from his ankle. The world slowed as the van hit the apex of the turn. The van lurched as the driver slammed the brakes, the tires screaming against the loose gravel. The sudden deceleration threw everything inside the cargo hold forward with violent force. The guard seated next to Elias lost his footing, his weight shifting uncontrollably as the vehicle skidded. This was the opening. Elias did not hesitate. He lunged forward, his body moving in perfect synchronization with the van's sudden stop. He drove his elbow into the guard's throat with every ounce of his remaining strength. The impact was sickeningly solid. The guard gasped, his hands flying to his neck as the air left his lungs in a sharp, choking wheeze. Elias did not stop there. He followed through with a secondary shove, pinning the man against the side of the van to prevent him from reaching for his weapon. The other captors were still reeling from the sudden stop, their balance shattered by the abrupt change in velocity. The initial shock held them paralyzed for a heartbeat. Elias stood over the gasping man, his gaze fixed on the rifle resting near the driver's side. The cabin was silent, save for the heavy, ragged breathing of the man struggling on the floor. The element of surprise was complete. Elias snatched the assault rifle from the floor as the guard crumpled. The weight of the steel felt familiar in his grip. He swiveled, leveling the barrel toward the two men nearest the front, his finger hovering over the safety. They froze, eyes widening, hands twitching toward their own sidearms. Elias barked a command, his voice cutting through the ringing in the cabin. He did not wait for their reaction. He slammed his heel into the rear latch mechanism, the metal groaning under the force of the strike. The heavy door swung outward, catching the wind and swinging wide into the night air. Outside, the forest blurred by at 40 miles per hour. The sudden influx of rushing air whipped through the cargo hold, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. Elias checked his footing on the vibrating floor, his gaze darting between the armed men and the gaping aperture behind him. The captors surged forward, but the instability of the moving vehicle hampered their coordination. Elias planted his weight, braced for the jump, and prepared to exit the van before they could bring their weapons to bear. Elias launched himself into the void, The world tilted sideways as he left the metal frame of the van, the rush of air swallowing the sound of his own exertion. He hit the gravel shoulder with his shoulder and hip, rolling immediately to dissipate the momentum. The ground was hard, tearing at his skin, but the rotation kept him moving. Behind him, the van tires sprayed dirt and stones as the driver slammed the brakes again. A flash of light erupted from the rear of the vehicle, followed by the sharp crack of rounds hitting the earth where he had been seconds before. Elias did not look back. He scrambled on hands and knees, pushing himself down a steep embankment into the darkness of the tree line. Branches whipped his face, and the thorns dragged at his limbs, but he forced his body forward through the thicket. He dove behind the trunk of a massive pine, pressing his back against the rough bark. The air in his lungs burned. Outside the brush, the shouting of the captors grew distant and erratic. He remained motionless, listening to the crunch of boots on gravel as they fanned out, searching the wrong direction. He was gone, swallowed by the forest. Elias exhaled, the sound barely audible against the rustle of needles. He allowed his heart rate to settle, forcing his pulse down with slow, deliberate breaths. The forest was no longer a chaotic maze of obstacles. It had become an extension of his own awareness. He stood, testing his weight on the uneven pine floor. The ground here was soft, damp with centuries of decay, offering a silent path where boots would usually crunch. He moved forward, stepping on the balls of his feet, his body angled to minimize his profile against the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy. Every sense was heightened. He felt the direction of the wind on his neck, alerting him to the position of his pursuers even before he heard their voices. He touched the rough bark of a pine, feeling the texture, finding the path of least resistance. The night air was crisp, sharpening his focus. He stopped, listening to the rhythmic beat of his own blood, waiting for the forest to reveal the location of the men who had taken the children. He was moving through the shadows now, a ghost among the timber, his presence felt only by the silence he left in his wake. The predator had arrived. A flicker of movement caught his eye. 30 yards ahead, a silhouette paced a narrow loop between two ancient oaks. The man held an assault rifle loosely, his posture relaxed. Unaware of the eyes tracking him from the gloom, Elias adjusted his grip, feeling the tension in his forearms. He crept forward, his feet finding purchase on patches of moss that dampened every vibration. The guard turned, his boots grinding against a patch of dry pine needles. The sound was sharp, unnatural in the quiet of the woods. Elias froze, pressing his body into the shadows of a low-hanging hemlock. The guard stopped, tilting his head as if questioning the stillness. He took a step toward the brush where Elias lay hidden. This was the moment. Elias lunged from the dark, moving faster than the guard could raise his weapon. He caught the man by the shoulder, spinning him around while clamping a hand over his mouth to stifle any sound. A single, controlled motion drove the air from the guard's lungs. The man collapsed before he could draw a breath to scream. Elias caught him, lowering the dead weight slowly to the needles, ensuring no rustle betrayed his success. He was now within the perimeter. Elias patted down the guard, his fingers quick and practiced. He found the radio clipped to the man's harness. As his thumb brushed the volume dial, a sharp burst of static erupted, followed by a voice laced with frantic energy. "Report, status report. We have lost contact with the perimeter." Elias held the device tight against his ear, his breathing shallow. He heard another voice, deeper and jagged with irritation, bark back through the speaker. "Stop pacing. Check the north sector again. He cannot have gone far." Elias analyzed the cadence and the background noise. He could hear the crunch of gravel and the metallic click of a safety being disengaged. He now had the map he needed. The kidnappers were scattered, their confidence shattered by the mounting silence. He slipped the radio into his own pocket, keeping the frequency open. The information was a weapon more lethal than the blade at his ankle. He stepped away from the body, sliding deeper into the pines. He knew exactly where the next target was positioned. The forest had stopped being a mystery. It had become a grid for his next move. He checked his surroundings one last time, turned north, and melted into the dark. Elias moved with fluid economy, shifting through the dense thicket toward the second target. He spotted the man standing near the edge of a steep rocky ravine, scanning the trees with an uneasy gaze. The guard was too close to the main camp for a direct strike, Elias needed him isolated. He knelt, his hand brushing the damp earth until his fingers closed around a jagged, fist-sized stone. He weighed it, then threw it with a sidearm flick toward a thick cluster of brush on the opposite side of the ravine. The rock hit the dry leaves with a sharp, distinct snap. The guard pivoted instantly, the barrel of his rifle swinging toward the sound. He took a cautious step forward, then another, his focus entirely consumed by the phantom noise. Elias watched from behind a thick pine, his pulse steady, tracking every shift in the man's weight. The guard descended the slope, sliding slightly on the loose shale, moving deeper into the shadows of the ravine floor. He was now 20 feet below the ridge, shielded from the sight of his comrades. The trap was set. Elias eased himself up, his eyes locked on the target below, waiting for the guard to turn his back. The guard reached the bottom of the ravine, his boots crunching loudly on the dry limestone. He paused, frowning as he realized the brush he heard was undisturbed. He turned, his shoulder brushing the damp moss of the cliffside. Elias descended the slope in 3 silent, bounding strides. Before the man could raise his weapon, Elias pivoted behind him, his forearm locked around the guard's throat, dragging him backward against the jagged rock face. The guard thrashed, his heels drumming a frantic rhythm against the earth, but Elias held him with the immovable weight of a man who had done this 1,000 times. The struggle ended in seconds. The guard went limp. Elias lowered him to the ground, his movements devoid of hesitation or excess energy. He checked the man's pulse, then stood, his breathing barely accelerated. For a heartbeat, the forest air seemed to sharpen around him. He did not look like a man who spent his days fishing. He looked like a machine calibrated for this exact work. He wiped his hands on the grass, secured the perimeter, and stepped over the body. He had purged the threat, silenced the alarm, and vanished back into the dark without leaving a single trace of his presence behind. Elias circled back toward the main camp, moving through the underbrush like a ripple in the wind. The firelight flickered against the canvas of the van, casting long, erratic shadows that he used to his advantage. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, watching the men pace near the vehicles. He picked up a heavy pine branch and hurled it into the darkness on the opposite side of the camp. It crashed into the dry brush with a sound like a heavy boot landing. The kidnappers spun around, weapons raised, shouting into the blackness. Elias did not wait. He moved to the flank, kicked a stack of metal fuel canisters, and retreated into the dense pines. The metallic clang echoed off the ravine walls, triggering a frantic discharge of gunfire into the trees. Chaos bloomed. The men were no longer guarding a location. They were firing at ghosts. Elias watched from a high ridge as they broke formation, their discipline dissolving into shouting and wild movement. He climbed higher, finding a vantage point above the flickering fire. Every move he made was designed to fracture their focus. He was no longer just an escapee. He was the apex predator in the dark, and the camp was now his hunting ground. The 2 men broke away from the fire, their flashlights cutting useless, trembling arcs through the night. They were looking for the source of the noise, but their steps were heavy and lacked intent. Elias tracked them from 30 yards back, his feet finding the softest patches of earth. He waited until they reached the dense thicket by the creek. One man stopped to check his radio, his back turned to the trees. Elias closed the gap in 3 fluid, silent lunges. He struck the first guard behind the ear, a single, precise impact that dropped him without a sound. The second man swung his weapon around, but the forest was already empty. Elias had melted away. He let the man stand in the dark for 10 agonizing seconds, listening to the frantic rhythm of his own breathing. Elias moved behind him and forced the barrel of the guard's own rifle into the dirt. The man spun, eyes wide, staring into the impenetrable black. He started to scream, but Elias silenced him with a swift strike to the throat. Back at the camp, the remaining men froze. They looked at the empty woods, then at each other. The realization hit them like a physical blow. They were not guarding a prisoner. They were being hunted by a ghost. The firelight seemed to dim, and the forest grew impossibly still, waiting for the next strike. The final 2 guards stood by the rear of the transport, their weapons held at low ready. They were shaking. The wind picked up, a sudden, sharp gust that rattled the high canopy of the pines, creating a chaotic symphony of creaking branches and rustling needles. Elias surged forward. The wind swallowed the sound of his boots on the dry needles. He was a blur of motion against the dark trunks. The guard closest to the vehicle turned, sensing a shift in the air, but he was a second too late. Elias drove his shoulder into the man, pinning him against the cold metal of the van. The impact knocked the wind out of the guard, and a single, swift strike to the temple rendered him unconscious. The second guard whipped his rifle around, his finger twitching on the trigger, but he fired into the empty air as Elias dropped to a low crouch. Elias swung his leg in a sweeping arc, catching the guard behind the knees. As the man fell, Elias rose to meet him, delivering a sharp blow to the neck that silenced him instantly. The camp fell into a heavy, suffocating quiet. The wind died down, leaving only the sound of Elias's steady, rhythmic breathing. He stood over the two bodies, his eyes fixed on the remaining figure standing near the dying fire. The leader stood alone in the center of the clearing. He looked at the bodies of his men, then scanned the perimeter, his head snapping toward every rustle of the leaves. He was breathing in ragged, uneven gasps. He gripped his rifle until his knuckles turned white, his eyes darting between the thick shadows of the pines. There was no sound back from the trees, only the crushing weight of the dark. He could not take the silence anymore. He raised his weapon and fired a blind burst into the thicket, the muzzle flashes illuminating the trees in jagged, strobe-like pulses. The roar of the gunfire shredded the stillness, but the forest offered no return fire. He emptied the magazine, the empty casing hitting the ground with a sharp metallic clatter that felt deafening in the void. He fumbled for another clip, his hands shaking so violently he dropped it into the dirt. He fell to his knees to retrieve it, his movements frantic and uncoordinated. 20 yards away, Elias stood perfectly still behind a thick cedar. He watched the man scramble, his own breathing shallow and controlled. He did not move. He waited. Every second the leader spent in this state was a second he grew weaker, his focus fracturing, his advantage slipping away into the night. Elias stepped out from behind the cedar as the man fumbled for the dropped magazine. The movement was fluid, silent, and absolute. The leader caught the shift in shadow and lunged upward, his hands clawing for Elias's throat with desperate, wild strength. Elias did not retreat. He pivoted, catching the man's wrist and driving his forearm into the leader's chest to break the charge. The impact sent the man stumbling back, his heels catching on a protruding root. He went down hard, but he scrambled to regain his footing immediately, swinging a heavy fist in a wide, panicked arc. Elias ducked beneath the blow, the air of the strike whistling past his ear. He stepped inside the man's guard, locked his arm, and utilized the man's own forward momentum to twist him into the damp earth. The leader slammed face first into the soil. Elias moved instantly, driving his knee into the small of the man's back and pinning his arm behind his shoulder blade. The man bucked, trying to throw the weight off, but Elias shifted his grip, applying pressure until the man went limp, gasping for air. The fight was over as quickly as it had begun. The forest settled into a heavy, expectant silence. Elias kept his knee pressed firmly against the leader's spine, feeling the man's heart hammering against the forest floor. He did not loosen his grip. He watched the man's breathing slow from jagged gasps to rhythmic, shallow exhales. Once the resistance ceased entirely, Elias reached down and stripped the man of his remaining belt. Binding his wrists with a quick, efficient knot, he stood up slowly. The transition from the high-intensity struggle to the stillness of the clearing hit him like a physical blow. His own breath hitched, coming in ragged, whistling bursts. He wiped a mixture of mud and sweat from his eyes with the back of his hand. His body began to betray him. His legs trembled, and a sharp, pulsing ache bloomed in his side where he had braced against the earlier impact. He leaned against a nearby tree, forcing his heart rate to drop, counting the seconds until his vision cleared. He checked the perimeter one last time, his gaze sweeping the dark tree line for any sign of movement. Nothing stirred. The forest was empty. He looked down at the immobilized man, then at his own stained hands. The threat was gone. He took a long, steadying breath, pushed off the trunk, and turned toward the hidden location of the children. Elias moved toward the cargo van, his boots silent on the packed dirt. The vehicle sat motionless, the rear doors still slightly ajar from his earlier escape. He paused, pressing his hand firmly against his side, fighting the wave of heat radiating from his wound. He bit his lip until he tasted iron, forcing his posture to straighten. He stepped to the rear of the van, gripped the handle, and pulled. The doors swung open with a metallic groan. Inside, the space was cramped and smelled of stale air and exhaust. His grandchildren were huddled in the far corner, their eyes wide and fixed on the opening. They flinched as light flooded the hold. Elias did not rush them. He kept his movements slow and deliberate, lowering himself to one knee to level his gaze with theirs. He kept his left arm tucked close to his torso, hidden from their view. "It is all right," he said, his voice steady and low. "The path is clear. Stay close to me, and do not look back." He reached out, offering a hand. The children hesitated for only a second before moving toward him, their movements jagged with lingering fear. Elias stood, shielding them from the darkness outside, and guided them toward the edge of the clearing. Elias kept his pace measured, his hands still clamped tight against his side. Every stride sent a jolt through his torso, but he adjusted his gait to hide the limp. He navigated the uneven forest floor, choosing the path of least resistance to keep the children from stumbling. They moved through the dense pines, their breathing audible in the cool night air. A root caught his boot, and he lurched forward, his grip on the children's hands tightening instinctively. He forced a grunt into a cough, straightened his spine, and kept walking. The forest canopy thinned as they approached the perimeter. He stopped, holding up a hand to signal silence. He leaned against a thick trunk, his forehead damp with sweat, waiting for the sharp, throbbing rhythm in his side to subside. He surveyed the dark road ahead. It was empty. The sound of distant crickets replaced the oppressive silence of the woods. He nudged the children forward, shielding them with his own body as they emerged from the brush. He checked the road in both directions, his eyes scanning for any sign of pursuit. Nothing moved. He took a steadying breath and stepped onto the asphalt, keeping his movements fluid and purposeful. The sky turned from ink to a pale, bruised violet. The darkness that had concealed the struggle retreated, driven back by the slow crawl of dawn. Elias stood at the edge of the state park boundary, watching the horizon soften. The forest, once a labyrinth of threats, stood silent and motionless in the early light. Birds began to call from the high branches, a sharp contrast to the silence he had enforced hours earlier. He turned his gaze toward the lake. The water lay flat, a sheet of glass reflecting the emerging colors of the sky. The surface was undisturbed by wind or ripple. He moved toward the shoreline, his boots crunching softly on the dew-covered grass. The air felt thin and cool, washing away the scent of pine and exhaust that had clung to him throughout the night. He stopped at the wooden dock, the planks damp under his weight. He looked back at the tree line one final time. It was just a forest again. The panic in the hunt existed only as a lingering ache in his side. He exhaled a long, steady breath, letting the tension leave his shoulders. The world was still. The lake was waiting. He stepped onto the dock and walked toward the end, his presence the only mark on the morning landscape. Elias lowered himself onto the weathered planks of the dock, the wood groaning slightly under his weight. He kept his movements slow, deliberate, and controlled. Beside him, his grandson scrambled to settle into place, clutching a small plastic rod. Elias reached into the tackle box, his fingers finding the familiar weight of the sinkers and hooks. He threaded the line through the eye of the hook, his hands steady despite the persistent throbbing in his torso. He cinched the knot tight with his teeth and pulled. The line hummed as he cast it out, the lead weight slicing into the surface of the lake. A ripple expanded outward, distorting the reflection of the trees. He handed the rod to the boy, guiding his small hands to grip the cork handle firmly. The boy watched the bobber intently as it settled into the blue water. Elias sat back, resting his heels against the edge of the dock, and looked out across the expanse. The water was perfectly still, holding the morning light in a steady, unmoving gaze. He kept his posture upright, watching the horizon, waiting for the first sign of a strike. The morning remained quiet, the only sound the gentle lapping of water against the wooden pilings. The sun climbed higher, casting a sharp, unforgiving light across the dock. Elias felt the warmth on his back, but his skin turned cold and gray. He leaned forward, bracing his weight against his knees. A sharp, rhythmic throb pulsed in his side, syncing with the beating of his heart. He pressed his left hand firmly against his ribs, pushing into the fabric of his shirt. Beneath his palm, the material felt heavy and slick. He caught a glimpse of dark crimson seeping through the weave, spreading in a slow, steady stain. He adjusted his position, shifting his body to block the boy's line of sight. Every breath required a focused, deliberate effort to keep his chest from shuddering. He gripped the edge of the dock with his right hand, his knuckles turning white as he fought the encroaching numbness. The world blurred at the edges, narrowing down to the small, bobbing red float in the water. He leaned further toward the edge, shielding his side with his own frame. He kept his eyes locked on the boy, ensuring the child saw only the lake and the horizon. He stayed motionless, anchoring himself to the wood, waiting for the line to move while the strength drained from his limbs. Elias felt the world tilt. His vision tunneled into a dark circle, leaving only the bright red bobber in the center of his focus. He forced the corners of his mouth upward, pulling his facial muscles into a mask of calm. The boy shifted beside him, unaware of the tremor in Elias's grip. The red bobber twitched. Then, it submerged with a sharp, sudden pull. Elias reached out, his movements heavy and slow, and steadied the boy's hands on the rod. He leaned closer, his voice a dry rasp against the morning air. "Wait for the pull," he whispered. He watched the boy reel in the slack, the tension in the line, vibrating through their connected touch. Elias felt his own grip loosen as the last of his strength ebbed away into the wood of the dock. He did not look at his side again. He watched the water break as the boy hauled the catch to the surface. The boy laughed, a sound of pure, unbroken light. Elias exhaled, his head bowing slightly toward the boy's shoulder. He watched the sun dance across the lake, satisfied. The line was tight, the boy was safe, and the water remained still. He closed his eyes, letting the sound of the lake become the last thing he knew.